welcome back. As Marlene mentioned just before we took our first commercial break, our conversation, the first conversation of the morning, will be with Dr. Wayne McLaughlin. He's a professor at the UWI Mona campus in Jamaica. And our discussion this morning is about all things marijuana, from the legalization to all other aspects of the trade, the consumption, etc. That being said, good morning, Dr. Wayne.
Good morning.
This is a broad topic that we're embarking upon this morning, but I want to begin first of all by getting from you a feed as to what has been the effect of the legalization process in Jamaica. I know that Jamaicans are proponents for marijuana, and recently you guys had also, kind of dealt with your amendments and your laws to be able to allow for consumption and trade. What has that been like there in terms of either a precedent being set or the overall scenario?
Yeah, morning again. Morning to your viewers. Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, Jamaica has been growing cannabis for a long time. And I use the word cannabis rather than marijuana for specific reasons. But for a very, very long time, we have been cultivating cannabis, illegally, of course. But in 2016, that changed and it was decriminalized, not legalized. Mm-hmm. So that's again a key difference. And the decriminalization basically allowed the cultivation and specifically for use as a medicinal plant. So the other area is that the religious use has also been approved, for the Rastafarians. Mm-hmm. So that's a two-prong that they introduced in 2016. So since then, of course, we have had quite a bit of interest from all over the world in how we can basically get involved in this cannabis industry, building out the industry. So it's really an industry, but coming with that, of course, are the key regulations. Yes. So building on that, of course, we had to put in regulations for the cultivation, the handling, transporting, processing, distribution, as in setting up dispensaries. So it really involved quite a bit. So it's a business. Don't forget, it's really a business.
Yeah.
Many places in the world, of course, as you know, the US, Canada has legalized it fully. US in some states have legalized it fully, but for both recreational and medicinal use. And of course, Germany, some countries in the EU, UK, using it medicinally. So we are basically now trying to build the industry. So it's an industry. Yeah. And getting to that stage, of course, we have to consider health benefits, what it can be used for, how the doctors are to be trained. So it involves a lot. So it's a real industry, as I say. It's not just growing cannabis in the field and somebody go and use it.
Yes.
Quality is important, right? So coming with that, we have also looked at regulations to manage the quality of the product.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I wanted to kind of, if I could just interject here before we lose the opportunity. Professor, you have been involved in cannabis research long before the legislative changes. In fact, you were the co-chair of the UWI Medicinal Cannabis Research Group, and you've been within the labs looking at the difference between the cannabis grown in different parts of Jamaica, and especially honing in on some of the particular uses that people can benefit from. Let's just talk about some of the highlights. It's been over a decade of research that you're looking at.
Even before that, the University of the West Indies in Mona, of course, has been doing quite a bit. The late Professor Manley West, he was in the pharmacology department at that time, was the first to develop a medicinal product from cannabis, and that was used for glaucoma. Okay. Right? So that has been on the market for many years in pharmacies. And following that, he developed another one for asthma. It's called Asthma Salt, again from the cannabis product. Then there was a lapse, of course, not much happened in between, his discovery work and so. Then we started back in 2010. So my lab basically started back in 2010, where we started to look at the types of cannabis we had in Jamaica. And this involved collecting material from all over, Jamaica, doing a lot of the characterization in terms of the genetics, looking at the levels of THC, CDB, looking at the levels of terpene, because that's important for you to have a database to see what you have. And then at that time, though, between 2010 and 2016, we weren't allowed to grow, but we could do all the other genetics work, all the chemical work. But when 2016 came, then we were able to cultivate. So we now have set up, of course, a laboratory with greenhouses that can actually grow the plant, and then we can look at the phenotypes. As you know, there are many different strains of cannabis. There have been many interbreeding, crossbreeding, which is what we have found in our work. So, for example, we could trace back cannabis all the way from the western end of Jamaica. Say, well, if you know Jamaica, it's like if you go to Westmoreland, St. Elizabeth, which is in the west central, we could trace the cannabis coming from those countries using genetic markers. So that's some of the work we have been doing. Also, very interestingly, when we started out, because of, as you know, the illegal trade, one of the things we wanted to know is that if an airplane landed in Miami containing cannabis, if we can say it actually originated from Jamaica. So that was part of the work we're doing early in terms of tracing our cannabis. And yes, we're able to do that in terms of genetic markers. So we do have a good database. Along with that, now we have developed different combinations of strains with different levels of THC, which we'll come back to later. THC, which is the psychoactive component of the cannabis, then CDB, and then we would have strains with high THC, some strains with high CDB, some strains with equal amounts of THC and CDB, and vice versa, high amounts of CDB and low amount of THC, because each component, of course, is very critical in terms of its use. Then on top of that, you have the terpenes, which is what you actually smell. That smell that you know when cannabis is around. Really because of the terpenes. And cannabis is one of those unique plants that has a whole range of terpenes. So for example, if you think of mango, that smell you get from mango is because it has the terpene myrcene. Typically, you'll find other crops will have single or one type of terpenes, like lemons would have limonene. But what you find with cannabis, which is very interesting, it has a whole range of terpenes, different combinations. And so you have different cannabis will give you different smell, different aromas. That is rather also interesting also with cannabis, because the terpenes do play a key role in enhancing the other properties. So for example, limonene or say myrcene will make you relax. So if you have a cannabis with high myrcene and high CDB actually also helps you to relax. So that sort of combinations we're looking at, and of course there are different uses in treating cancer, epilepsy, as we mentioned,
asthma and
go ahead.
No, I was going to say that there's quite a bit to unpack there. So a few things that you did mention, where the science is now looking at how the individual components in the cannabis can in fact provide different results, especially when you're talking about medicinal use. So if you're talking about asthma, pain management, glaucoma, anxiety, I know in some of the countries where the industry is more developed, they now create products specifically for different effects based on altering CBD and THC levels. So they're already there. And here we're still, and I'll say here for Belize, we're still at an earlier point. And I want to get your perspective in here, Professor. We're still at the point where we're trying to move away from vilifying cannabis itself before we can move to, I mean, the laws may progress if it's passed through the House, but there still is a perception that has to be changed. Let's talk about your experience with that, especially since you are diving into the science and you understand more than most how it affects people and their minds and their bodies.
Yes, well, as I said, it's stigmatized, which is true. It's gonna take a while to get over that. But believe it or not, a lot of persons use cannabis, right? Not openly, of course, because of the whole stigma associated with it. But it's something that we'll have to, in terms of education, letting people know that it's not just, the psychoactive part of it, but the other properties are really, really important medicinally. And it has been used traditionally for centuries. You're talking about centuries, right? Not just today.
Yeah.
And that has been discovered by, our forefathers of the different medicinal properties. Anxiety, as you just mentioned, insomnia, people are anorexic, properties where they just can't eat, so it opens your appetite, for pain management, reducing pain. So again, it goes back to the different strains, as I mentioned. And as you said, different countries will have gone more advanced in terms of what they have done to develop strains to deal with specific medical issues. And that is where we are getting to, actually. So to build the industry, as you just mentioned, you're at the rudimentary stages, is really to put in the facilities to allow, to explore those medicinal properties, laboratory facility for, testing. That is going to be important. The quality is going to be important, because if you're going to be giving persons with medical issues, you don't want to give them cannabis that's contaminated, with spores or with other chemical.
I want to hear more about that, because we did have a consultant who once joined us and is very involved in this process locally. And he spoke of the poor, now, nobody wants to hear bad things about their own product, but he was saying that tests done with marijuana that he's gotten in Belize were unhealthy, that there are things like mold and other things involved, and spores. So can you shed some light on that? Is that fact, and what are the consequences of that?
So as you dwell in the cultivation process, it's not just growing the plant outside. It involves a lot of management.
Okay.
Because I guess
okay, we have a bit of a freeze there. Professor, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. Yes.
We just lost you for about 10 seconds. Go ahead.
Right. I'm just saying, in terms of the cultivation process, it's an art and it's a science, because the end product have to be of good quality. And how do you get to that good quality? Crop management. So from harvesting, it has to be dried properly at the proper humidity, at the proper temperature, because you don't want to have molds growing in the final product. So outside, because our environment is quite humid.
Yes.
Okay? So that has to be a challenge. So it has to be dried to a certain percentage, 10% moisture. So that has to be done in a cool environment, with good air exchange, not more than 24 degrees C or 22 degrees C. And that will, of course, minimize the possibility of molds. Now, these molds can be dangerous, because quite a few of them may have what are called toxins. And those toxins, of course, can kill, or at some, cause persons to become ill. So the quality is key. No, for us, of course, we have a lot of sunshine. Okay?
Yeah.
In the US and Canada, they depend on growing indoors. So the quality control is much better. But even growing indoors or in greenhouses, that can be managed. That level of quality can be managed.
So
So green,
let me ask you a question here, Doc, if I can quickly.
yeah,
I don't know that there's that kind of strict quality control when it comes to the person who is selling cannabis loosely in a retail sense.
yeah.
So is it to say then that what is being consumed locally is subject to these very toxins that you're discussing?
Exactly, because how it is prepared, how it is harvested, how it is dried, how it is stored. For example, you have to have a relatively cool environment to store the cannabis in. And that does not for just keeping the molds out, but also to maintain the levels of the cannabinoids that are present. If you store it at a temperature that's too high, in hot environment, for example, it's gonna lose the cannabinoids like CDB. It's gonna lose terpenes. It's gonna lose, because the terpenes are very volatile. Because it's gonna lose THC. So you don't want to have that, level of poor quality. So
So what your research has shown, and what you are in fact, I think, being able, we've kind of heard that coming out from the beginning conversations here, that there has to be control mechanisms put in place for people who will supply or distribute.
yes, has to.
Let's step back to the basics though, because we did talk a bit about the stigma that will take some time for people to be able to shift. But there are valid concerns. If you have never used cannabis and you've only seen images or explanations of persons who are high, who somehow seem to not be functioning at full capacity, whether a bit slow or lethargic or spaced out, that's your assumption as to what this drug does to everyone. So let's talk about the effects, and let's talk about potential damage to individuals who use. What does the research say?
Right. So what we're looking at basically in different strains is the level of THC.
Yes.
That is the psychoactive component.
Yes.
I know traditionally, the levels of THC has increased over the years. So normally from, the traditional cultivations, you'd find a THC level of say 5% on average. That is what we found. But you'll have breeders who are very much interested in developing or breeding strains that would be up to 20% THC. Now that is the strain that basically now will give you that high. And if you smoke cannabis, it gives you that high very, very quickly. So it's absorbed through the blood, pass through the blood-brain barrier to the brain, and that is what gives you the high.
Okay.
That is what we have to be careful of. As you say, as a new user, again, you have to know the concentration of the THC. So that is what is going to be key in terms of its medicinal value.
So it's like when people have one drink versus 5 drinks.
Exactly. So you have to know your as a naive user, you have to know what levels you're going to be starting off with. One of the recommendations is that you start low, and then you measure the effect, as you increase the amount or the intake of cannabis.
What about the fact that people call it a gateway drug?
It hasn't really been found. Publications really haven't found that, in terms of it being a gateway drug. It really separate that concept of being a gateway drug. It's not like heroin where you get full addicted, or cocaine where you get addicted.
That was going to be my next question. What is the addiction rate to marijuana?
Well, for publication, I basically looked at compared to heroin or cocaine, it's really low on this, very low on the scale. So if it's 100, a scale of 100, and you have cocaine, heroin, up that, it's probably down to about 20%.
Okay.
And what about physical or mental damage due to the drug?
Right. So again, what we encourage, of course, is that if you're below the age of 18, younger, your brain still developing, so that is where the education comes in. You really have to educate the population, educate the young persons to avoid the use of cannabis because it can have effect on the development of the brain. For example, pregnant women, you wouldn't encourage pregnant women to use cannabis, even though they do. So this is some of the things you really have to educate our population on.
Talk to us about the social impact since the decriminalization process in Jamaica. I know that here in Belize, the argument from the churches, for instance, they're saying, well, look, when we look around, it's a majority of young people that are consuming, and these are the persons who are not completing school, who are engaged in crime and violence and that sort of stuff.
Well, as with most crime, there are other social issues that one has have to also take in consideration. Opportunities, other opportunities, not just, the fact that, they are involved in crime, but other things will deter people from going, the crime, the criminal direction. And it also will be the same with cannabis. Again, education, finding other opportunities, that will help. Because again, with papers, our colleague psychiatrists at Mona here, they really haven't seen any major increase in crime caused from people using cannabis.
Yeah. Doctor, tell us about, from your perspective, the conversation about decriminalization or legalization of marijuana has been around for a long time, and we're starting to see some of the changes. For the more developed countries to have made this step first. I don't know if that perhaps is part of our impetus or, but the bigger picture is, I know you have spoken out publicly in Jamaica about how lucrative the business can be if the country would allow itself to open up for legalization. Tell us your thoughts on that. Do you think the Caribbean is lagging behind?
Well, we are. We have been. As you know, as Jamaica has been involved in cannabis cultivation for many years, but there are opportunities still. We haven't, as you say, missed the boat completely.
Okay.
We really should have been further afield. The other aspects of how the industry, as I said, can develop, looking at medical tourism, for example. In the Caribbean area, we have a lot of tourists that come to the different parts of the Caribbean. I would imagine about half of those persons that come use cannabis for medicinal use. And if they come to Jamaica, to Belize, to Antigua, for example, just recently legalized and started their first farm, just about 2 weeks ago. It can open up quite a bit. And remember, it's not just the cannabis alone that is going to benefit, not just the cannabis industry alone that's going to benefit, because you're going to have spin-off. For example, persons who design greenhouses, agronomists, different labs, different processing, to develop new products. So it's gonna spin off into many other different, industries. Tourism, for example, it could spin off into tourism. So the opportunities are I say really great, but I say we have to know actually trying to catch up now, basically.
Okay, Professor. So what I want to do is find out more about what it's been like since the changes in the legislation in Jamaica to today. But we'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about some of the similarities that we have with our new proposed legislation, and also what the effects have been like there in Jamaica. We'll tackle that after the break, so viewers, please stay tuned.
Whether you're at home, on the road, at work, or at school, if you see news happening or suspect that something might be up, call or text the Channel 5 News Belize tip line at 672-5555. You don't have to give us your name, just give us the tip. That's 672-5555. Call or text us so we can check it out.
Dwayne Moody, Isani Cayetano, Andrea Polanco, Paul Lopez. Your News 5 Belize teams do whatever it takes. Go wherever they need to go, so you can catch the story wherever you are, whenever you want, on whatever device. Channel 5 Belize on television, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Because news is now everywhere, all the time. And so are we.
We are back and we continue our conversation with Professor Wayne McLaughlin from the UWI Mona campus in Jamaica. So, Professor McLaughlin, we were about to begin discussing the legal aspect in terms of the legislative changes that occurred in Jamaica in 2016 and what that framework included. Can you jump in at this point to kind of share with us an overview of what that process was like and what has taken place in the 5 years since then?
Okay, good. As part of my other portfolio is that I'm also a member of the Cannabis Licensing Authority.
Okay.
So of Jamaica. So we basically, again, it's highly regulated. So cannabis is still a regulated product, even though it's decriminalized, or in some countries it may be, fully legalized, but it's still regulated because, as you know, different conventions, of course, still are enforced that prevents, the export and other just general use of cannabis or cultivation. So what was basically set up was a licensing authority, which is the Cannabis Licensing Authority. And they are basically the regulators. So for a person to get in the business, you have to have a license. So you have to get a license for cultivation, or if you want to process, you have to get a license for processing, for transport, for setting up a dispensary, or what we call a smokehouse. Persons can go and purchase, cannabis and use it in that property. So it's fully regulated, and at each step, each applicant have to go through a really rigorous process in terms of security checks, and which can take weeks, months sometimes, to get a license in place. And of course, it's not cheap. Getting a license is not cheap. So that has been one of the bugbears or challenges we have had in Jamaica, where the traditional farmers, and we hope that Belize will look at that in their legislation, where the traditional farmers are really a part of this process. We're not.
That is the core of one of the concerns that we have here in Belize. Whether or not this move in creating an industry for cannabis will in fact box out those who've been making a living from it for so long.
Well, part of what we have looked at is called an alternative development program, which basically try to get the traditional farmers up in Akompong, which is the maroon areas, different areas in Westmoreland that have been cultivating cannabis for years, for them to come as a group. So you'd have to look at something like a co-op, because it's not, as I said, it's to put up just 10,000 square feet greenhouse. You have to put in security fence, security cameras, hire security guards, systems that will monitor it from, remote monitoring. So it's not cheap. So we have this in place, and we are really still struggling with it in some, aspects, of course. But getting the traditional farmers, involved is going to be important.
So from a legal perspective, were there any allowances or accommodations made for the person who do the hand-to-hand retail? While we're looking at the farming aspect of it, was there any, leeway given to people who were making a living from the sale of marijuana at the retail level?
Technically, no, but you're allowed to have 52 grams, 2 ounces, for personal use. But it is still illegal to sell, just, as by the street side, but it's sort of overlooked. It's not really something that is, if you have more, of course, they're going to think that you're really in
trafficking or trade,
You also allow for household plants. I think in Jamaica it's up to 5 household plants.
Right. Regulation again allows for each person in the household to have 5 plants. So if you have 10 persons in the household,
you can have 50 plants.
Oh, okay.
Right. So you are allowed 5 plants each.
Let me ask you something here again, Doc, because perhaps I'm totally naive where cultivation and production is concerned. What would be the quantity that one can get from 5 plants?
Okay, so you can get up to, let me see, we can, from 1 plant, we can get probably up to 100 grams sometimes per harvest. Right, so you can get quite a bit. You definitely can get more than the 50, the 2 ounces. Definitely you can. But again, that has to be kept in the private property. It's like you can go to the street side, set up like a shack, side their house, outside. So that would be legal. And this is where the dispensaries come in now. So there are legal dispensaries, which basically do sell cannabis and cannabis products. So how it is done now, you have to get not really a prescription, but a recommendation from a medical doctor
to go to the dispensary.
Right, to go to the dispensary for it to be prescribed. So most of the dispensaries do have their own doctors, basically. And some do it remotely, so you don't have to have a doctor sitting at the dispensary, so the patient and the doctor can be done remotely.
That's interesting. Where is the medical community? And I'm sure maybe UWI, because they train doctors as well. Where are we in getting the medical community engaged in the conversation? Because if a doctor is giving a prescription, they have to see the value in the medicinal.
Right. Yes, that is so true. That is so true. Again, because of our tradition of westernized medicine, it's not fully in the curriculum, in terms of even the cannabinoid system. We have an endocannabinoid system. All of us, right? Because it functions in many, many different ways, right? So cannabis is an exocannabinoid, meaning that you take in that to enhance, different functions and properties. But that part of it, what we do offer is CMEs for training for doctors. So that's again part of the whole process, that you really have to involve the doctors and get them trained. And there are quite a few who dispense and use cannabis in their practice, right? Not to say you don't have any. So there are some that really uses it, especially for pain management. So, and
okay, so the biggest question, I guess, is looking at a part of the push in the legalization or kind of the formalization of marijuana or cannabis trade is looking at how it may impact crime, especially gang activity. 6 years later or 5 years later, what are the effects on crime in Jamaica?
Well, again, we haven't really seen an increase related to cannabis, in terms of crime, meaning that for, gang war between, generally, trading or, things like that. But we really haven't seen an increase in crime. But for those who export illegally, they're not going to stop exporting illegally, So I don't think it's stopping that. But what it will do is that it could cut down on the amount of illegal cultivation where you get these people in the legal system. So that is one of the pluses that they're looking at in terms of reducing the amount of illegal cultivation and involving those people in the legal, in the legal trade. But for crime itself, related specifically to cannabis, we haven't really seen an increase in that.
Yeah.
Let me ask, okay.
Of course, you still see that because, cocaine is still, a big issue, in terms of illegal involving gangs and so, in terms
from a medical point of view here, what are some of the long-term effects of cannabis consumption, particularly for people who smoke marijuana? I know you have different kinds of rolling papers, right? And so some people would argue that smoking Fonto is perhaps more dangerous on the long term than other people who smoke bamboo, for instance, right? So how does that work on the long term?
Well, just to say, we don't encourage, as part of the regulation, encourage smoking. As you know, we have a law against smoking, so it's regardless of cigarette or cannabis. So in general, no smoking. But of course, some persons still smoke it because it offers a very quicker relief. Right? So that is the reason for smoking. It offers a quicker relief. It doesn't last long. The relief doesn't last long compared to if you use it as in an edible form. Extract or oil. But the thing with the edible form, it takes a longer time for you to feel the effect. So there's a trade-off there. So, but for the long-term use of cannabis by smoking, that can have health effects, just like smoking cigarettes. So that's why it's discouraged. So
Professor, I was going to say, in your years of experience in doing research and understanding more about benefits and challenges, I'm sure you've engaged in quite a few debates about whether or not legalization is the best way to go. What do you find, what is your approach to getting the information out so people can feel better informed as to whether it's a right or wrong move for a country like Belize?
Okay. So from my perspective, my opinion is, of course, it should be more from the medicinal use.
Yes.
Not the recreational, general use.
Yeah.
So that is my, thought as a scientist, of course, because, we try to make the best, of what we have. But persons are still gonna use it recreationally. Right? So that we can't avoid, right? So for the overall benefits, again, as I said, the industry is still new to us. This is something that we really should try to build support from all angles, of course, from the government side, they have to put in support. And just to give an example, in Antigua, a new company had just their first cultivation license was granted. And part of that association was with the private company, with the government of Antigua, and the Rastafarian group. So it's a tripartite, agreement in terms of setting up this business. And so the government is involved, right?
Interesting.
So this is something that I said from Belize's point, our aspect, looking at the traditional farmers, get them in groups, get them to be organized. And I said they don't have all the cash to set up this thing, so they may put in labor, other assets, get the private company involved. And what we have done in Jamaica is that the business must be 51% owned by Jamaicans.
Okay.
So the majority shareholder in that company has to be Jamaican, 51%. So those are the things you could look at in terms of setting up, the industry in Belize. Try to make the ownership, Belizean.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Rather than foreign, business. Yeah. Because what had happened with us, we had a lot of companies coming from the US, Canada, pumping a lot of money, putting up these house, cultivation sites, everything. But there was no export. There are still countries there that would not accept cannabis from other countries. For example, in the US, you cannot export to Canada, except for research purposes.
Yes.
Right? They didn't see all of this, right?
Yeah.
So of course they spent all this money setting up, and now they have left,
Yeah.
because they really didn't see the wider industry. But the US is opening up now, as you know. They have passed a couple new legislation, so hopefully with the Biden administration, they may,
And that would make a huge difference, because that's a big challenge in looking at the regulatory system that has to be in place globally.
Yeah, banking is a big challenge.
Yeah, yeah.
Banking is gonna be a big challenge until the U.S. federal government, recognizes and approves it.
Yeah.
Right. So
do you
many banks will not accept or open an account for a cannabis company in Jamaica.
Professor, just before we close, since you have been you spent so many years working in a lab looking at the medicinal uses, potential medicinal uses for cannabis, we've seen where very often things that we have been using traditionally in this part of the world, in fact, they become prominent in other countries. Somebody else comes out and says, turmeric is a miracle fruit, moringa is a miracle herb, and it takes off. And we don't necessarily take the lead on things we've been using traditionally for a long time. Looking at where you are with your cannabis research, what are some of the emerging areas that you think the Caribbean can really shine in putting forward as a potential use for cannabis?
Well, looking at it in general, the areas that we have been working on as the lab basically is on cancer. So like prostate cancer, or looking at breast cancer, there's a very active research group in the pharmacology section in the Faculty of Medical Sciences. And they have shown some really excellent results in terms of treating prostate cancer. And again, not to say that THC is bad, because THC is really the active component that is really providing that anti-cancer property.
Okay.
Right? So again, the research is really key. So cancers is really key. Pain, I would say pain management, the arthritis, epilepsy, although all numbers of, epileptic persons are maybe not that high as in the US, but again, once the market can open up, we look at that opportunity. So the, anxiety, depression, those are some of the key areas. But the cancer is gonna be one of the big areas.
Okay.
To look at, with great prospects.
Well, Professor, we are grateful to get a new perspective on the conversation about cannabis. And as we mentioned earlier, Belize is kind of just getting a start going in understanding more about where this can happen and where this can lead us. And Jamaica is 5 years in. So you add some great perspective there as to what's been taking place. Any final thoughts as we close?
Well, just to say that, don't forget the traditional farmers, those that have been involved in cultivation for eons of years long before us, the industrial people and, the commercial side of it. Oh. So they're going to be key, because as I say, it's an art, and they have that art, in how to cultivate.
That's right.
This is where we as now, the technology will come in to make the product better.
That's right.
So it will involve both.
Thank you so much, Professor.
You're welcome.
All right. With that, we're going to go ahead and take a break, and we will be back talking about even more agricultural opportunities, this time horticulture training through the Belize Botanic Garden. That's coming up.